Hello there, community. Good morning from Kansas City, Missouri. I am Jason Rom, standing in for a vacationing Aubrey King. Today is August 14th, 2024, and this is the F5 Quarterly Security Notification. F5 discloses security vulnerabilities and security exposures for F5 products quarterly, and the QSN dates are published in advance so customers can schedule necessary updates in advance of the public disclosure dates. Next quarter's QSN is scheduled for October 16th, 2024. So get that on your calendar promptly. Joining me today from the F5 Security Incident Response Team is Security Titan and aficionado of legacy. Hold on. Lost it. Joining me today from the F5 Security Incident Response Team is Security Titan and aficionado of legacy consumer hardware, Aaron Brailsford. Aaron, how are you today? And what vulnerability insights bringeth thee?
Hey, thanks, Jason. Thanks for the intro. So yeah, you're right. We're here to talk about the August QSN, which you'll be glad to hear is a pretty small QSN. We're only disclosing 9 issues today. The disclosure date, like it says there, was 7 a.m. Pacific, so a couple of hours ago. We're disclosing 0 critical issues, so that's good. And only 1 issue that was reported to us by an external researcher. If you are using any of BIG-IP TMOS, Next SBK and CNF, or NextCentral Manager in your environment, or NGINX, either open source or plus, you probably want to take a look at what we disclosed today. If you're using any other products or distributed cloud services, you aren't impacted, and so you can move on and ignore this one. Like you already said, Jason, the date is October the 16th for the next QSN. So we can break those issues down a little bit by severity and product and type like we normally do. We have 4 highs and 5 mediums. 4 of those impact TMOS. We have 1 that impacts SBK and CNF, 3 that impact NextCentral Manager. We have, as with the last couple of QSNs, a sort of 50-50 split between data plane and control plane. So 4 control plane issues. That is things like the configuration utility for BIG-IP, BIG-IP NextCentral Manager, BIG-IQ if it was impacted. Those are all things that you use to administer the systems. They don't handle user traffic. And 5 data plane issues, so that is constructs that handle user traffic, so things like virtual servers on classic BIG-IP, or application definitions on BIG-IP Next. For NGINX, both of the issues that we disclosed today affect NGINX Plus, and one of them affects only NGINX open source. There's a little asterisk there next to severity. Those severity buckets are per CVSS v3.1 scoring. We're calling that out this time because if any of you have actually looked at the security advisories already, you'll notice we have scores under both CVSS v3.1 and CVSS version 4. We'll get onto that in a couple of slides' time because that's a new thing for this QSN. These are the minimum versions that you need to be running to have got everything we've disclosed today fixed. So 17.1.1, which actually came out a little while ago, 16.1.5, which came out very recently, SBK CNF 19.1.2, and NextCM 22.1, which is the latest release. For NGINX, the versions are over there on the right, but I'll call out 15.1.10. 3 of the vulnerabilities we've disclosed today do not have a fix for version 15 in a downloadable version. Fixes are available in engineering hotfixes on request. So if you're running version 15.1 and you're on, say, 15.1.10 latest, and you need any of those vulnerability fixes, you'll need to request an engineering hotfix through support. And previous QSNs, we have made pre-built engineering hotfixes available on MyF5 under the downloads. We've actually found that most customers who are running BIG-IP 15 and who need an engineering hotfix for these vulnerabilities already have an engineering hotfix installed, so they had to request a custom one anyway. So we've done away with making them available by default because it didn't actually help anybody. Since we only have 9 issues, we've got time to sort of run through some of the issues one by one, actually all of the issues one by one, so we can break down a few and maybe clear up any confusion. We should have time at the end for Q&A if anybody has questions about these. So the 2 highs that we disclosed today for Big IP TMOS, they affect specific platforms and or specific configurations. So you'll need to check whether you actually fall into an affected scenario before scrambling to update. The first there, 39778, that affects HSB platforms, which is everything but the R series platforms that's currently supported, but only stateless virtual servers. And that is specifically the virtual server type of stateless. So when you configure a virtual server on Big IP, you can pick virtual server type, and there's an option in there that's called stateless, specifically that virtual server type. The workaround for this is to configure a stateless virtual server another way, and that's to set the idle timeout to immediate on a UDP profile. That makes the virtual server effectively stateless because for UDP, the datagram comes in, is handled, and then we discard the connection table entry. Every time one arrives, it's a new connection, therefore stateless. So if you have that configuration in place, if you have a standard virtual server with a UDP profile with immediate timeout, you aren't affected. And that is actually the workaround for if you have a stateless virtual server type configured. The second issue down, 41727, that impacts only R2000 and R4000 series hardware or Big IP Virtual Edition if you are using the Intel E810 NIC. There's no specific mitigation here, unfortunately. It's a denial of service through crash if you run into it, and the only option is to update to a fixed software release if you are running R2000 or R4000 or a VE with the Intel E810 NIC. Other Intel NICs are not affected. Third one down there, 41164, is a medium. This only impacts you if you are using the MP-TCP option or the multipath TCP option in the TCP profile. Big IP TMOS, so LTM and those products, and Next, CNF, and SPK are similarly affected. Again, this is a crash type denial of service. General DOS mitigations apply, which is to use HA, which will obviously somewhat mitigate the impact of a crash type DOS. And the last issue there, 41723, is iControl REST, our old friend from previous QSNs. This is quite a low impact vulnerability in reality. You need to be an authenticated attacker, so the attacker needs valid credentials for iControl REST. And it's a limited information disclosure. The attacker can obtain usernames of other users configured on the system. So this could be used for, say, username harvesting, but it's not going to directly impact the Big IP itself. There's no specific mitigation here. There's just a general mitigation for authenticated hackers, which is if you can't update to a fixed release, restrict access to iControl REST to trusted networks or trusted devices and trusted users, which limits your attack surface to a malicious insider. For version 15 that we called out on the last slide, the only one of these issues that's fixed in version 15 is 41164, the MP-TCP issue. The other issues are unfixed in 15X. So like I say, if you're on 15X and you need a fix for either the stateless virtual server issue, the Intel NIC issue, R2000, R4000 issue, or the iControl REST issue, you'd need to request an engineering hotfix through support. Next up, there's 3 issues that impact Big IP Next CM. The highest severity issue here, now remember these are all control plane issues because CM is a control plane product, and typically control plane products are installed in privileged networks or and should be accessible only to trusted authenticated users. However, the first issue there is basically a session hijack issue. The mitigation here is safe browsing practices. So we've talked about those a lot in the past for big IP LTM configuration utility vulnerabilities. And that's things like don't use the same browser to administer NextCM that you use to do general internet browsing. If you have a session open to NextCM, be careful what links you click in your email while it's open, if that's your default browser, things like that. I think the real world impact of this is probably limited because, like I say, should only be trusted networks, trusted users, and generally administrators who apply safe practices using NextCM. But the next two mediums, so lower impact. The first one there, 37028. You can use the password reset functionality, or I should say abuse the password reset functionality to lock out another account on NextCM, but only if that account has never been used. Nobody's ever logged into that account. So the mitigation here realistically is to, if you configure a user account on NextCM, make sure it's one that is actively being used. If it's actively being used and has been logged into, then it can't be impacted by this. And the last one, 41719, impacts the QKView functionality in NextCM. It turns out that the credentials used to upload the QKView to iHealth might be included in the log files, which means they would be visible to other people with access to the QKViews in iHealth, potentially. Now, I do know that it's relatively straightforward to invalidate those credentials once you've uploaded the QKView to iHealth. And that might be good practice to do anyway, but certainly with this vulnerability existing, good practice unless you move to a fixed release. Like I say, these are all fixed in 22.1. So if you're on 22.1, you don't need to worry about any of them. And lastly, in terms of issues to break down, the two NGINX issues, they both affect specific modules. The first one there is only NGINX Plus, and it's only the MQTT filter. So if you aren't using the MQTT filter, you don't need to worry. If you are, the only mitigation is to disable MQTT functionality. So realistically, if you are using MQTT, you probably want to update to a fixed release. And the second one there, 7347, that's both open source and NGINX Plus, but it's specifically the MP4 parser. Maliciously constructed MP4 file could cause NGINX to crash. Again, there's no real mitigation other than not using the functionality. So if you are using the MP4 parser, you will need to update to a fixed release. All right, now probably the more interesting part of this QSN, at least from my perspective, is the fact that we are now scoring issues with both CVSS version 3.1 and CVSS version 4. That is new in this QSN. And it only applies to what we call first-party security issues. So that is vulnerabilities in F5 code that we disclose as part of the QSN. Right now, we aren't going to be dual scoring for third-party issues. So that's things like a vulnerability in Apache or OpenSSL or OpenSSH, some third-party component that we use. We will continue to use only CVSS version 3.1 scores for those. That's largely because upstream providers are mostly using CVSS v3.1. And we consume those scores and modify them to be appropriate for our product's use case. The upshot of this is, though, that as you can see in this screenshot here, the score might differ between the score produced with the version 3.1 calculation and the version 4.0 calculation. Typically, the scores are quite close to one another. And that means that typically the severity bucket doesn't change, so high, medium, and low, but occasionally it might change. I'll break down the differences on the next slide. We've updated all of our documentation on MyF5 to talk about CVSS version 4 scoring, and we have a dedicated knowledge base article that discusses our rationale, like why are we doing this, and how do you interpret the fact that the two scores might differ. K000140.363 on MyF5. Just briefly, though, we are doing this because we wish to be industry leaders, because CVSS version 4.0 is being quickly adopted by groups like CISA, scanners like Nessus, and other competitors to F5. And we want to be up there leading from the front. CVSS version 4 is a tweak to CVSS version 3. It means that we can maybe more accurately score some vulnerabilities. It breaks out some of the vectors, and I won't get too into the weeds here on the differences between version 3 and version 4 scores, but version 4, just briefly, attack complexity was a single vector in version 3.1. And that describes how difficult it is to exploit a vulnerability. And in CVSS version 4, we now have attack complexity and attack requirements. It kind of breaks attack complexity up into two, so we can be more granular with our scoring. And CVSS version 4 also lets us score any impact to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of systems behind the F5 product. That would typically be what we called security exposures in past QSNs, which we didn't score. With CVSS version 4, we will be able to score those going forward. There aren't any security exposures in this QSN, so kind of doesn't make any difference. But all right, I'll just break down quickly, or rather, we can just show this slide. We don't have to talk through the whole thing, but there's only one vulnerability in this QSN that actually moved severity bucket. So 41164 went from a medium to a high. Actually quite a large swing. If anybody's really interested in why that vulnerability swung so violently between medium and high scores between the two scoring mechanisms, all of our security advisories, the CVSS score is a link, and if you click that link, it will take you to the first.org CVSS calculator, which will break down the CVSS vector that we used to create that score. And you'll be able to see exactly what went into that 8.2 or that 5.9, and you can see how, and you can start to get an idea of what aspects of a vulnerability might cause it to score differently between the two scoring mechanisms. And that's all I had. So now we've got time for questions, if anybody has any.
From my perspective, what for you, what are the big changes from 3.1 to 4 that you see as beneficial to the scoring system overall? Like what are the advances that you see are helpful, and any concerns you might have over the changes?
So I think version 4 is a significant step forward. Attack complexity is something that causes a lot of sort of consternation in CVSS v3. It's not an easy one to say, where does this vulnerability fit between low and high? Right? And there's the scoring guidelines produced by the CVSS working group, the CVSS SIG. And we have our own scoring guidelines in F5, but it's still not always clear where it should fit. And breaking attack complexity and attack requirements out into two separate vectors makes the guidelines much more straightforward. It's much easier to see where they should fall. And it gives us, instead of just attack complexity low and high, now we have complexity low and high, which have been sort of simplified from CVSS 3.1, and attack requirements none and present. And none and present is much easier to determine. It's much better to break the two out. There's also privileges required, which in user interaction, which in CVSS 3.1 was just there is no user interaction or user interaction required. Required just meant that as an attacker, I have to try and get a user to take some action before the vulnerability can be exploited. Whereas in v4 scoring, we have passive and active. So user interaction none is obviously the same. Passive means that the targeted user has to do something, but they don't require me to coerce you into doing it. So that would be, say, like a stored XSS might be passive. If it's stored on a page that you will always go to when you log into the configuration utility, it's passive. If I have to try and get you to click on a link, then it's active user interaction.
Gotcha.
I think the single biggest thing in version 4, though, is the subsequent system impact metric, which is what's going to allow us to score security exposures by their impact to the system behind the big IP or behind the big IP Next device or wherever it's behind. I know that's something that customers have brought up in a number of previous QSNs, like how do we understand how bad this security exposure is in our environment? We've always had to say, well, look, consider it a high, but try and understand it within the context of your environment. And now we can actually score it. So you have a way of really easily classifying it.
Okay. Yeah. So rather than how does this impact my big IP, but how does this impact my applications? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. Did have a question come in from Podcat. What are the account teams using 3.1 or 4? Maybe just some clarity from them. What do you mean? Like, from what do you mean by account team? Like how the scoring is represented to customers in conversations, or what? I'm not sure what you're getting at. Is that clear to you?
Well, I can talk about it in a general term while Podcat clarifies. We're providing both scores in all of our written published documentation, right? v3.1 and version 4.0 scores. And our guidance is to everybody, but specifically to customers, that if you want to say, if you have a question, which score should I use, right? Should I use the v.3.1 score or should I use the version 4 score? Use whichever one all of your internal processes are already set up for, which right now is probably version 3.1. If the account team has a close enough relationship with the customer to understand how that customer is consuming vulnerabilities, like do they have processes that consume version 3.1 or do they have processes that consume version 4? I'd expect the account team to present it in the way that the customer's expecting it. So that sort of answers the question.
Yeah.
We'll present it in our security advisories, which is the source of truth, with both scores. And it's up to a customer as to whether they want to use the version 3.1 score or the version 4 score. I think you will see the industry move towards version 4, I think, more quickly than we moved from version 2 to version 3.1. So as customers, I would suggest that people take a look at version 4 and start looking at how they can use that in their environments with their own tooling, with whatever processes they have in place.
Sounds good. All right, we got another one from a tool. The stateless vulnerability, does that affect the big IP DNS's VIP, where the DNS has the listeners as VIP on UDP 53? So I don't know if he's specifically asking about the LTM side of DNS services or a GTM listener, which is slightly different in how that's configured.
Yeah, that is a good question. I don't believe, though I would have to double check.
He clarified that there's a VIP on the GTM to listen.
Yeah, so I don't believe the GTM listener is a stateless virtual type. So as far as I understand, it's not impacted by this. Though we'll try and clarify that. And if it is impacted, make sure that is made clear in the security advisory.
Okay. Thanks for the question, Atul and Popcat. That's all we have for questions from the audience. Anything to say on our way out, other than we have the next QSN again is October 16th, 2024, which is 2 months away. And yeah.
Yeah, I would just say, well, two things then, that as my colleague Magazone mentioned, first.org have some good training courses available for both version 3.1 and version 4.0. So if you are looking to start using CVSS version 4 within your organization to prioritize patching and drive your own processes, take a look at those courses. They are really good. And yes, you just said that obviously October is only 2 months away. We typically bring that last quarter QSN forward slightly to avoid the holiday period of things like Thanksgiving and some other stuff that typically happens in November. So that's why it's slightly earlier than you might expect.
That's very kind of us.
I know, right? Unlike the one that we had on Valentine's Day.
Yeah. I watched that one yesterday, just to prepare since I was stepping in for Aubrey today. But okay, well, that's a from where I'm sitting, that was a fairly wonderful QSN for us to have. And if you are vulnerable in any way on those, make sure you're patching your systems. Oh, I did want to say on 15, you have the engineering hotfixes available. That end of tech support for 15.1 is December of this year anyway. So you're hopefully going to be moving off of that to 16.1 or 17.1 by the end of this year. So if you have not made those plans, make those plans. Get updated onto things that will be supported moving into the new year of 2025.
Yeah, there is one fly in the ointment to that, actually, which is that FIPS you're basically stuck on 15 if you need FIPS certification. FIPS certification for 17 is in the works.
Yeah.
So I know that the end of software development date for FIPS platforms was pushed out an extra year, but the advice still stands, right? Unless you are constrained to version 15 for FIPS.
Right.
And I would strongly suggest version 17 because version 16 goes end of software development the middle of next year currently.
Right. Yeah, that's June or July of 2025. Yeah.
So you're not buying yourself
make
much
the jump,
time.
Go ahead and make the jump to 17.1, right? All right. Well, thank you, community, for joining us for the code release security notification. And Aaron, as always, thank you for representing the CERT to bring all of this awareness to the community.
Well, thanks for checking out that video. If you have any questions, leave a comment down below. While you're down there, hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. You might want to check out one of these videos over here. And if you haven't already, go check out community.f5.com. This is where all the DevCentral Connects hosts hang out, as well as the rest of the community. It's free to sign up, and we'll see you there.